Hey folks, Doug Dalma back here with part two of the Presbyterian Philosopher. If you saw the first episode, you'll know that I'm reading through my book on biography on Gordon H. Clark and making some comments along the way. So this time I'm trying, for the first time in my life, I'm trying YouTube Live, and hopefully it saves properly for me. And I didn't schedule this, so probably won't have many watching or any commenters coming on right now. But maybe sometime in the future, if I can plan an event, then people can be on and ask questions live. But as life goes, you find a small window to do these things. I did have a PSA for DIYers, and that is to move your thumb out of the way before the hammer strikes whatever you're working on. So that was a fun episode yesterday that I'm feeling today. That's about it. So it's a little bit of a fireside chat here. This isn't exactly audiobook, so I can pause to pour and drink coffee and to make comments. So we're on chapter 2 now in the biography, where I talk about the influences on Gordon Clark. Of course, the first chapter with his Presbyterian heritage is a significant amount of his influence there, especially from his father, who was a Presbyterian minister, but really the whole family being engrossed in the Presbyterian world for many generations in both Scotland and England and America. So now in chapter 2, we get into more of the philosophical influences on Clark, apart from Old Princeton and those fellas. So we'll take a jump right into there as we read chapter 2. And it looks like I looked this over briefly ahead of time. It's a fairly short chapter, so this might be a bit of a shorter video. If anyone does end up seeing me live and adds questions, I'll be sure to answer them, of course. So here we start. Gordon Clark's intellectual influences. I do these little, I think they're called epigrams at the beginning of each chapter. It was kind of a lazy author's way of putting in a quote that might not fit anywhere else. I know some people don't prefer them. I know my brother doesn't like these epigrams, but I have a little one here from Dr. Clark's lecture on Logos, and he says this: if one goes back to the Westminster Divines, to Calvin, even to Aquinas, and especially to Augustine, he will find that human nature is regularly divided into intellect and will. The point is important because faith in Christ is not an emotion, but a volition. One does not feel for Christ, he decides for Christ. That, of course, is a big discussion within Clarkian circles as we defend Clark's view of faith against many others. And it's interesting, even people within the Protestant Reformed Church, who are very friendly to Clark on a lot of subjects, don't like his view on faith. That's a complicated discussion that I don't get involved in here in the biography. In fact, that was one of the criticisms, I believe, from Alan Strange, that I didn't talk about that. I believe it was him, and there's some other sort of OPC critics of Dr. Clark. I was fortunate not to have many real criticisms of my book. I think it was Strange's who was maybe the most critical, saying, oh, he didn't talk about this or talk about that. He wanted me to talk about basically the places where he felt Clark is the weakest, to put it lightly, if not where he thinks Clark is outright heretical. But that's, in my opinion, pushing it. And when I wrote the biography, there was a lot of subjects. You know, Dr. Clark was a philosopher. He wrote on many, many subjects. They certainly can't all fit into the book. So the ones that fit here in the book well are the ones that come up in his lifetime. That not just things that he wrote about or worked about, but actually have an impact to the church and the scene that was going on. I mean, as we continue into this book and run into the Clark Van Til controversy, we'll see that these philosophical / theological questions were right there. They fit in the historical circumstances, and there was reasons that they were coming up. It wasn't suddenly in the 1940s, Dr. Clarke had one view and Dr. Van Til had another view, but these things had existed in differences among Reformed thinkers for centuries and really came to a head there. So I think of the Clarke-Van Til controversy as a very central, if not the central, philosophical debate in Reformed circles in the 20th century. And it's somewhat of a shame that people don't know about it. And of course, it's a great shame that the seminaries have largely taken Van Til's side on these things because of, number of reasons, but for Van Til working within that seminary while Clarke worked in a secular university. As I've studied it, and I know many others, as we study this, I've known very few not to come in agreement with Dr. Clarke. There's some, who study it and seem to study it just from the Van Til side, and they remain there. But I've known a number of Van Tilians to convert, in a sense, to Dr. Clarke's views on many of these philosophical subjects when they really study it. I don't know if I've ever heard of a Clarkean saying, "No, Clarke was wrong. I'm switching to Van Til." So I think that tells us something when we get into those later discussions. But here I am on minute 6, and I haven't read one word of the chapter yet, so we'll continue on. Gordon Clarke was influenced not only by the Presbyterian tradition in which he was raised, but also by the philosophers whom he read and studied at the University of Pennsylvania. Though many philosophers avoid reading the Bible and many Christians eschew worldly philosophy, Clarke read from both traditions. He was both a Christian and a philosopher. He read widely in both Christianity and philosophy, to the effect that he learned to defend Christianity with a clear understanding of the alternatives. I think that's absolutely crucial. I got a little dirt on my screen here. That's absolutely crucial to see how Clarke isn't just sort of studying in this Christian vacuum. And in fact, as we'll see, he's really surrounded by a lot of secular thinkers at the University of Pennsylvania, and that gives him a chance to really defend the faith much more frequently in these discussions than, say, a Christian who's teaching at a Bible college might just have all Christians around him and just assume that he has answers to things, but they might not be convincing to non-believers. Okay, continuing. In his approach to his writings, he sought to demonstrate the logical consistency of Christianity while exposing the logical inconsistencies of other philosophies. That's really a hallmark of his apologetic method. And of course, it's a part of what should be everybody's apologetic method. But Clarke emphasizes consistency more consistently than other thinkers. Clarke wrote on both Greek philosophy and Christian thought, often addressing their intersection. He was a prolific writer, producing at least 40 published books and more than 200 articles during his career. His writings can be placed conveniently into 4 categories. This is my own construction. No one has really tried to divide these writings up, but it was something I noticed, and I think a lot of thinkers do this. I myself too. It's you have an interest for a while. I, for maybe 4 years, read everything I could on Austrian economics, on Mises and Rothbard and Menger and Eugen von Bawerk and all of these figures before I found, through John Robbins' writings, I found Dr. Clarke's books, and then spent 4 or 5 years reading Dr. Clarke. So you see the same thing here with Dr. Clarke, having this interest certainly in his college time, and both as a student and as a professor there at Penn. He's writing on ancient Greek philosophy. That's sort of his main focus. He becomes an expert on the early Greeks. Then number 2, I have listed here Christian philosophical constructions, and this is, of course, where I'm very interested in Clarke. It's the Christian philosophy. These two concepts that sometimes are put opposed to each other, but is something that as Christians we shouldn't overlook. We shouldn't overlook the fact that the Bible has better answers to the philosophical questions than the philosophers do. We always have to realize that the philosophers don't agree among themselves. There's wildly different views in philosophy. But when we look at the Christian worldview and what the scriptures teach, I think we find a much more consistent philosophy, and a philosophy that explains more of our life and in this world. Okay, so those philosophical instructions of Clarke, I put middle, 1946 to 72, and then kind of a break, and then I say later, 1980 to 87. Of course, he dies in 85, but his books continue to come out after he's passed. In the middle here, number 3, I said sort of in the middle of his life, he has the Critiques of Non-Christian Philosophies, 1960 to 64. That's when he criticizes Karl Barth, he criticizes Dewey, and some others, and that's an important period in his life. And then only really at the end of his life, this 4th section on biblical commentaries, he did. It seems quite early on he had started work on commentary on, I think, First Peter, maybe Second Peter, and so he has one of those published back in 1967. But most of his biblical commentaries, which are basically New Testament epistles, are later in life. And those have some real gems in it to help understand Clarke's philosophy. And I think sometimes he answers questions that other commentators seem to skirt around. And so I've been very helped out by Dr. Clarke's commentaries, because you keep pushing some of these questions to their logical conclusions and really struggling with them. And then you read Clarke and he has an answer, and you say, why didn't I think of that? That's kind of it's a real brilliance that you see there. Okay, continuing. Clarke's first publications appeared shortly after he earned his PhD. These writings concern topics he had studied in philosophy classes in graduate school. Prior to the early 1940s, most of Clarke's writings concerned philosophy, not Christianity directly. In addition to his dissertation, Empedocles and Anaxagoras and Aristotle's De Anima, he was involved in the writing of 4 books on philosophy, 2 as an author and 2 as contributor. Reading in Ethics, 1931, Selections from Early Greek Philosophy, 1934, Selections from Hellenistic Philosophy, 1940, and A History of Philosophy, 1941. Later, Clarke produced a fairly popular textbook, Thales to Dewey, a general overview of the history of philosophy. And it's that Thales to Dewey, I said fairly popular. It's hard to really reach back, to a publisher or someone else and find out just how many were produced. But this is one that was used at a number of Christian colleges, and you'll still find people who had used Thales to Dewey back, say, in the 70s or 80s, still being used at Christian colleges. And so Dr. Clarke's name might be familiar to them because of that book. Continuing. In thinking about philosophical matters, Clarke looked not to the latest trends, but to the classic writers. He critiqued the spirit of college students who preferred to study only the latest theories to be in the know, rather than studying the theories of history's greatest thinkers. He wrote, "There is a tendency to regard college as a young gentleman's finishing school with consequent superficiality. This view, in my opinion, leads to the acceptance of every new idea simply because it is up to date." And we continue to be plagued by that type of thought in our world. It seems, particularly with this movement of wokeism today, it's a bandwagon type philosophy, just like postmodernism was. People get brought into this. I don't know if they're trying to seek some advantage in the world through these philosophies, but people like to be up to date. And I was just thinking about this the other day, how funny it is that just a couple years ago, the big thing was being a critic of plastic straws, right? We better not use plastic straws. The whole planet's going under. And they would make these laws, and you'd have to have metal straws or something in California, reusable straws. And then now post coronavirus, or maybe we're still within coronavirus. Now we can't imagine anything reusable, and we're taking, wearing these silly masks and making them disposable, throwing them away, creating tons of trash. So people just jump on um, these ideas, and I certainly am pro plastic straw and anti mask. I think all of this modern stuff that comes and goes is what I classify under one category of what I call silliness. The world has devolved into silliness, and maybe that's what we can do, is laugh at it rather than being angry at how dumb people are. So, continuing. It was the ancient Greeks, particularly the philosopher Plato and his students, that most caught Clarke's attention. Fundamentally, Plato argued that there was more to the world than what could be ascertained from the senses. He posited a suprasensible world, a plane of existence where the true forms behind sensory objects lie. In Plato's realm of forms, ideas exist independently of physical nature. This view appealed to Clarke because he could agree that true forms of a sort existed, not in some other realm, but in a similar way in or as the very mind of the God of the Bible. So now I have a section on Clarke, Plotinus, and divine simplicity. And this is something that I considered trying to expand on, and I really hit some walls. It's obviously a big discussion. I had a brief conversation with James Dolezal, who has written a couple well-selling books on the topic of divine simplicity. And I think Clarke was hitting this in some fashion, this subject of divine simplicity. And I remember even asking Dolezal, do you think that divine simplicity was at the root of the Clarke Van Til debate? And he said no. And certainly it doesn't come up in the records. And I don't know to what extent Dolezal knows the Clarke Van Til debate, but he said no. I think there's some certainly connection there. If it's not spoken about, at least something is related to that, and the differences in Clarke and Van Til's views on incomprehensibility. But we'll read this section and see what it says. In his earliest writings, Clarke focused his work on the philosophy of Plotinus, AD 205 to 270, a prominent philosopher in the tradition of Plato. Clarke aggressively studied Plotinus, reading his entire works, the Aeneads, in the original Greek. And that's still in Dr. Clarke's library at Sangre de Cristo Seminary. His books, most of them are there. And that set of Plotinus is on the shelf. I believe if it's green, if I remember rightly, it's something like 6 or 7 volumes, and they've got Latin, or not Latin, Greek letters on them. It might be they're listed, I think, rather than numerically. I think they're listed with alphabetical characters, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, following the Greek alphabet. And I'm not sure there's even a trace of English in there. So you can see his ability in languages. He read Greek, the ancient Greek, fluently almost, and then Greek German and French and other languages as well. So he described the school of Plotinus as the flower and culmination of all Greek philosophy. I'm sure I mentioned this later on. It's just too funny not to put in the biography that Dr. Clarke, after the controversy and he's looking for a new job and he's struggling, he writes to one of his friends and says, maybe I'll just spend my life as a mediocre Plotinian. And it's one of those, I remember a friend in college saying, try to type in some words into Google search that have never been put in that combination before, or words that will show up with the fewest pages on the internet. And I think mediocre Plotinian, I would suspect that wouldn't bring back very many responses. So I always thought that was funny that Dr. Clarke would call himself that, especially as someone, he had been published a number of times. He wrote a number of articles on Plotinus. It's hard to say he's that mediocre. Okay. Nevertheless, Clarke rejected a key aspect of Plotinus's philosophy, his doctrine of God, or what Plotinus called the One. For Plotinus, the One was not only supreme, totally transcendent, and indivisible, but was also without distinctions and beyond all categories of being and non being. Clarke believed that the biblical view of God was at variance with such a frozen picture of the divine. Rather, he held that the God of the Bible is a living, willing being. Clarke wrote, God is a living God, not a Plotinic one. And similarly, Plotinus, this is Clarke saying this, Plotinus explicitly denied will to his one, but will is one of the most prominent aspects of the biblical deity. Furthermore, Clarke believed the biblical view of God included distinctions, these distinctions being the persons of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He wrote, for Christians, the doctrine of the Trinity precludes a simplicity that would reduce God to a Neoplatonic one. Thus, it was clear to Clarke that one must not confuse the Christian concept of God with the pagan Greek philosophical concepts of God like that of Plotinus. In Clarke's view, the God of the Bible is not simple in the Plotinian sense of lack of distinctions, because distinctions are necessary to differentiate the three persons of the Trinity. Yet Clarke did believe that God is simple in the sense that his attributes are identical, what theologians call the doctrine of divine simplicity. Especially in his later works, Clarke argued in favor of divine simplicity. In Clarke's The Incarnation, 1988, he called honorable the view that all attributes are identical in God. In the Johannine Logos, 1972, commenting on 1 Corinthians 1:24, where Christ is called the power of God as well as the wisdom of God, Clarke wrote, power, wisdom, and word are identical. For in the simplicity of the divine essence, all attributes merge. Clarke also argued for divine simplicity in his unpublished Systematic Theology, 1977, where concluding a chapter on God, he wrote, God therefore is his substance. His substance is his attributes. All his attributes are one, and this one is God. So there really is no doubt that Dr. Clarke held to divine simplicity. That systematic theology, I don't know if it's the first time I mention it in here, one of my footnotes, apparently not on this page, explains more about how the systematic theology was rediscovered in the course of the biography work by Dr. Clarke's grandson, Andrew Zeller, the president of Sangre de Cristo Seminary. As I was looking for more papers, Andrew recalled some in the basement of the library there and was able to find these. And I think they had been known, and some others maybe had found them previously. But my work typing them up and working with the family made them accessible online. Though Clarke accepted the doctrine of divine simplicity, it is challenging to understand how he reconciled it with his epistemology. In fact, I know of one person who seems to have, left not only Dr. Clarke, but the Christian faith and really gone off the deep end with this issue, trying to reconcile divine simplicity with Dr. Clarke's epistemology. I think when we struggle with something like that, we should continue onwards and not sort of throw out the whole ordeal because of some difficult philosophical question with Christianity. The person I'm speaking of, it might be known to some other Clarkians, but is not perhaps one whose views should be listened to too closely. If it is not too much to anticipate the controversy detailed in later chapters of this biography, Clarke took the position that for man to know anything at all, he must know at least some of the same objects, the same propositions that God knows. At first glance, the doctrine of divine simplicity might seem to indicate that man, unless he becomes divine, cannot know that which God knows. The challenge arises. Either man knows what God knows, thus sharing at least one of the attributes of God, and therefore, by divine simplicity, is God, Or man does not know what God knows and therefore knows nothing at all, i.e., skepticism. So that's where a big problem was, and where I was looking at um, trying to write more about an answer. I still have like maybe a page worth of stuff where I was trying to work out this philosophical question more clearly, and I ended up not putting in the biography. It was too hairy. As a couple other philosophical questions I've looked at with Dr. Clark, I feel like his approach to philosophy has helped me out, but it doesn't mean by any means that I'm capable of solving all philosophical questions. I would love to see Dr. Clark's work become more popular and more well known so that his approach could help to really work out some of these difficult questions. That's part of my goal here. Although I do hope to, as I mentioned in the last video, I do hope to write on his philosophy and um, elucidate and explain some of those challenging issues. Clark, however, held that it was possible for man to know the same propositions of God as God knows without sharing identically the attributes of God. For Clark, while the object of knowledge of both man and God is identical, the mode of man's knowledge differs from the mode of God's knowledge. The mode of man's knowledge, Clark maintained, is discursive, whereas the mode of God's knowledge is intuitive. In other words, man learns one item at a time, but God knows all things and always has. Though this mode distinction may not provide an exhaustive solution to the challenge mentioned above, it must be seen as an integral part of Clark's answer. The importance of the doctrine of divine simplicity, as it applied to Clark's own life and career, should become evident in the chapters in this volume, 6 through 8, on the controversy which bears Clark's name. Though the term divine simplicity was not mentioned in the controversy, Clark's opposition held that his epistemology violated the creature creator distinction, or creator creature distinction, a distinction intimately related to God's simple nature. I'd mentioned that as chapters 6 through 8. I'm not sure that I'm right there. Let's see. No, that is right. It is chapters 6 through 8. Okay, new section. Augustine, not Augustine, which is a city in Florida, but St. Augustine, Calvin, and the Westminster Confession. Far above Plato or Plotinus, it was thinkers in the tradition of Reformed Christianity that influenced Clark's life and thought. Like many theologians of the Reformation, Clark was in large part an Augustinian, a follower of St. Augustine, St. Augustine, AD 354 to 430, and as such, took many of his ideas directly from the ancient church father. Clark was reading Augustine in depth soon after he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. In 1932, he sought the advice of Ned Stonehouse, professor of New Testament at Westminster Theological Seminary, on a question regarding Augustine. And in 1934, he wrote again to Stonehouse, mentioning that he was slowly plowing through 512 pages of double columns of Augustine's City of God. According to Clark's former student, Dr. Kenneth Talbot, Dr. Clark always spoke to me about his earliest influences of St. Augustine. He believed any theological or philosophical student needed to read Augustine's writings. The influence of Augustine on Clark can be seen in the many elements he adopted from Augustine's writings, including a type of idealism, his divine illumination theory, and a rejection of empiricism. Augustine was the first Christian thinker to integrate Plato's idealism with Christianity. Whereas Plato held that there was another realm in which the forms or ideas resided, Augustine, like the pre-Christian Jewish philosopher Plato, or Philo before him, identified the location of this realm as the mind of God. Augustine took the theory a step further in arguing that the basic items in God's mind were not ideas but propositions. Unlike Platonic ideas, propositions have a truth value. That is, they can be either true or false. Clark accepted Augustine's theory wholeheartedly. I've written some more on this since the biography. I wrote an article on divine illumination theory and which version of it Clark held. It turns out there's 4 or more theories of what Augustine was saying. And that's kind of a problem. And I think that's where Clark tries to be clearer. There's not a lot of camps of Clarkians. There's some disagreements among people who, maybe like John Robbins more, or like what Dr. Talbot and Whitfield Seminary have said more. Um, but essentially, Clark is clear, where not a lot of Christian thinkers, even St. Augustine, has a lot of lack of clarity in what he's saying, hence the division over his views. In Clark's Lord God of Truth, alongside Augustine's De Magistro, or Concerning the Teacher, which he printed with it, Clark's reliance on Augustine's epistemological theory of divine illumination is evident. In his theory, Augustine argued that truth comes only from the Logos, our divine teacher, and not from our own independent efforts. Clark, in like manner, wrote, "Ideas are in God, and the mind can perceive them only there." In a lecture later in his life, Clark explained Augustine on this topic. Here's a quote from Clark. "I would recommend that you read Augustine's treatise called De Magistro. This is the original refutation of logical positivism and the language philosophies that are common today. By the time you get through it, you will see that ink marks on a paper or sounds in the air, the noise I'm making, never teach anybody anything. That is good Augustinianism. And Protestantism is supposed to be Augustinian. At least it was in its initiation. And it was the most unfortunate event that Thomas Aquinas came in and replaced Augustinianism with Aristotelianism and empiricism, which has been an affliction ever since. But the point is that ink marks on a paper and the sound of a voice, that this sort of thing never generates any idea at all. And Augustine's solution of it is that the Magister is Christ. Christ is the light that lighteth every man that comes into the world. This is not a matter of regeneration. This is a matter of knowledge. And Christ enlightens the unregenerate in this sense, just as well as the regenerate. If an unregenerate man learns anything at all, he learns it from Jesus Christ and not from ink marks on a paper." Well, that's a very good quote. I should steal that for the book I'm writing on Clark's thought. But I'll probably have that accessed, included there. Augustine's theory of divine illumination, depending on God's involvement in knowledge acquisition, is at odds with the theory of empiricism, which holds that man learns on his own through his senses. One modern introduction to Augustine's On Faith in Things Unseen explains. The purpose of Augustine's writing is to refute that crass empiricism which would admit no faith in the truths of revelation because they cannot be seen, that is, perceived by our sensory experience. Though Clark referred to Augustine as an anti-empiricist, he also noted that Augustine had not purged his thought of all empirical elements. And there again, Clark becomes more consistent in more radically getting rid of a cognitive role for the senses. That Clark will deal with that question elsewhere. Well, what is the role of the senses? Well, they tell us of pain. They're a warning for pain. And he says they are a stimulus to intellectual intuition. So they may be involved in some way indirectly in knowledge acquisition, but not directly. It's not through the senses that we learn, though they may it may be related in that they occur at the same occasion. Okay. Augustine's thought permeated the Reformation through reformers like Martin Luther, who was himself an Augustinian monk. It was in part due to Augustine's insights that Luther began to diverge from the accepted Roman Catholic teachings. Yet among Reformation thinkers, it was not Martin Luther, but John Calvin who most influenced Clark. Clark praised Calvin as Paul's best interpreter. In Calvin, as exemplified in the Institutes, Clark found a thoroughly systematic and consistent Christianity which he embraced. Furthermore, Clark saw Calvin's epistemology as akin to his own, in that Calvin looked to the scriptures as the sole source of knowledge. Clark argued that Calvin rejected sensation as the basis of knowledge, and was fond of quoting Calvin's definition of knowledge. This is Calvin. "I call that knowledge, not which is innate in man, nor what is by diligence acquired, but that which is delivered to us by the law and the prophets." The system which Clarke admired in Calvin was most thoroughly and fully developed in the 1640s with the Westminster Confession of Faith. The influence of the Westminster Confession of Faith on Clarke led him to write What Presbyterians Believe in 1956, in which he walked through the confession point by point. As a Presbyterian minister, Clarke took seriously his ordination vow to the system of doctrine contained in the confession. The nature of the confession, having been formulated and signed by hundreds of theologians, meant that its teachings were of no one's private interpretation of Scripture. The confession also was written at a time when the biblical thought of the Reformation had reached its apex and maturity. The Calvinistic and confessional tradition of the Westminster Confession of Faith was continued in the old school Presbyterianism of Princeton Seminary. Clarke was influenced greatly by the theologians of Princeton. Among these was Charles Hodge, about whom Clarke wrote, Charles Hodge, I think, as I may say, is the greatest theologian America has so far produced. Which is funny because if Clarke mentions Hodge, he's always criticizing him. But I think it shows his admiration of Hodge that he's willing to criticize Hodge on those few places where he disagrees. Clarke wrote, continuing on here. Also among the Princeton theologians who influenced Clarke were Charles Hodge's son, A. Hodge, B.B. Warfield, and professors less well known today, Francis Landy Patton and William Benton Green. Did I get that right? I always get confused if it's Benton Green or Brenton Green. But yes, Francis Landy Patton, Francis L. Patton, was someone that Clarke had a number of his sermons or tracts in his library. So some of these other Princeton guys are less well known today. We hear about Archibald Alexander and Charles Hodge, A. Hodge, B.B. Warfield, and J. Gresham Machen. But there really were quite a few other professors who had an impact in their own day that are less well known. And in the Greens, two different Greens, William Benton or Brenton Green, and there's a Henry. I can't remember his name. There's another Green as well. Okay, continuing. Thus, labels befitting Clarke include Christian, Augustinian, Calvinist, and Presbyterian. But in addition to these labels, Clarke was a Machenite, a follower and supporter of J. Gresham Machen, 1881 to 1937, the leader of the continued Princeton tradition in the 1920s and 1930s. Machen was a personal friend of Clarke. In addition to 22 extant letters between Clarke and Machen, there are a number of Machen's books in Clarke's personal collection. Clarke became involved in the Machen-led struggle for a new reformation in the Presbyterian Church, USA. His role in this struggle is the topic of the next chapter. So this was a very broad overview of those intellectual influence. And I thought I was coming to something I don't have until a couple chapters later, where I talk about the origins of presuppositionalism. And there you'll see other influences on Clarke from Abraham Kuyper and James Orr, and even Van Til. You'll see that. So we haven't really exhausted his influence. There's the influence of the Princeton Presbyterian tradition, the influence of Plato, Plotinus, St. Augustine, and other philosophers, and then really for him more modern Reformed thinkers. Not only Calvin and Westminster, not so much modern, but Kuyper and Orr and others that were just leading up to Clarke's time. So that is the end of chapter 2. Next, we'll get to chapter 3 on Gordon Clarke and the formation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, where we'll see some of his interactions with J. Gresham Machen. I don't know if somewhere in here I note that Machen was friends with Dr. Clarke's father as well, David Scott Clarke. And there's at least one record that shows that David Scott Clarke allowed Machen to use his church for some of their early meetings as they were working towards forming that denomination, the OPC. So we'll see in that next chapter also Clarke's involvement there in a number of ways as a real proponent of this return to biblical fidelity. And this, reading Presbyterian history as I have, not only through Clark's life, but others, has made me to see the necessity of these types of reforming movements. And it's why I think I'm such a proponent of what's going on today in the PCA to reform or possibly leave that denomination. And that's really kind of a curious thing as a student of history, particularly Presbyterian history, is what's going to happen there. We've seen the Vanguard Presbytery already created from mostly churches that have left the PCA. And it's gotten a number of ministers in more recent time that have, I think, helped out its credibility, but it looks still like a smaller movement. So we'll see if there's other movements that emerge. But you see as the PCUSA, even by the 1920s and 30s, was so horribly corrupt and apostate in places that it was necessary for these reforming movements inside the church and secession movements out of the church. I think that's the case now in the PCA as well, and it's harder and harder for traditional ministers to tolerate what's happening in the PCA. And I think the way Dr. Clark would look at it, he said once in 1973 to a man in the PCUSA, he said, in 1967, you got rid of the confession and you made this book of confessions, none of which you're obligated to believe. And he said about the PCUSA, you're not required to believe anything, therefore you're not a church. We see, or I see in the Presbyterian Church today, we know there's these three marks of the church. There's biblical preaching, gospel focused, and then there's the sacraments being rightly administered, and then the third mark of the church that many non-reformed traditions forget is discipline. And right now, what we're seeing in the PCA is a lack of discipline regarding the issues in, I believe it's the Missouri Presbytery. First off, for a couple decades now with Federal Vision, but now also with these issues of self-proclaimed gay but chaste minister, or ministers maybe. I think there might be more than one. And so anyways, there's an unwillingness to discipline by the PCA. And therefore, this is, Clark's type of logic, therefore, you're missing one of the marks of the church. You're not having proper discipline, which I believe it's not referring to only at your local level, discipline of the members of a church under the session, but really a proper church also has a way to discipline the ministers by the presbytery and synod or general assembly. And if that's not happening, if there's not discipline, then it's missing one of the marks of the church. And you might conclude it's kind of rough, might conclude it's not a church. There are still good things going on in many of the PCA churches, as there are true believers in even non-reformed churches that don't have discipline, but yet it's missing something very important, one of those three marks of the church. So yeah, I think Dr. Clark would be quite a proponent of these movements for change. I've argued that in a sense, Dr. Clark would probably, had he lived, he would have been in the Bible Presbyterian Church. And that's not only sort of wishful thinking because I'm now a Bible Presbyterian minister, but it's really quite a fact because Dr. Clark had last had his ministerial credentials in a small group that was called the Covenant Presbytery, which later merged after Dr. Clark's passing. That group later merged into the BPC, the Bible Presbyterian Church. So Dr. Clark, had he lived, his credentials would have been moved over there. And I don't think he would have had any objections to that. He had been friends with men like Alan McRae, who was a Bible Presbyterian scholar. And he had a long friendship with J. Oliver Buswell, who for a time was with the Bible Presbyterians. He had picked on Francis Schaeffer a little bit, but I don't think Clarke would have had objections to being in the BPC. So today, yeah, he would have been looking at those former secession movements and existing secessions as a good thing. I think Vanguard and whatever else might come about in the PCA. Let's see. This is less than. Oh, I just got a question from Daniel. Hi, Doug, or hi, Dalma. I'm from Brazil. I appreciate Clarke's books. I purchased your ebook. Excellent. Enjoy it a lot. I have always been thrilled to see the interest in Dr. Clarke's work among Brazilians. He has Brazilians of fans in Brazil, and particularly Felipe Sabino's work there in translating Dr. Clarke's books. And I remember when I was working on the biography, there was at one point Felipe thought that maybe I could come down there and talk to some people. It didn't end up working out, and maybe now in our coronavirus world, it's even harder to travel. But I would love for a full expenses paid trip to Brazil to visit all the Clarkians. But obviously, it's a large country, so you're not all in the same place. But I appreciate what's going on down there. And it seems, I can't read Portuguese, but it seems like there's a vigorous debate for years on Clarke and Van Til, which there has been in English, although I feel like it's faded some in recent years. And I hope Sean Garrity can help push for more debate. I've loved Sean's articles. Some might think that, like Dr. Robbins, that Garrity might be kind of tough on his blog, but I love it. I think Garrity's work is brilliant, and if someone's offended, sorry, but yeah, I think we'll call it there, and we'll try to get to chapter 3 here sometime shortly. It's hard to know when an opening works. I hope when I end this live stream that I'll be able to save it, and you'll all get to see it when you're able. So, God's blessings. Goodbye.